What hurts more, being betrayed by an enemy or watching your own flesh and blood rise against you to steal your throne? This isn't just a family story. This is a tale of pride, ambition, betrayal, and the devastating price we pay when we set ourselves against God's will. This is the story of Absalom, the beautiful prince who had everything yet wanted more, the son who shattered his father's heart in pursuit of a crown that was never meant to be his. Picture this, a kingdom at its golden peak, a father who loves too deeply, a son too proud to wait, and a collision course that would end in tragedy, teaching us lessons that echo through thousands of years to this very day. But before we dive into this epic tale of rebellion and heartbreak, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt overlooked? Have you ever believed you deserved better than what you had? Have you ever looked at someone in authority and thought, I could do that better? If so, then you understand the seeds from which Absalom's tragedy grew. Because this isn't just an ancient story. This is a mirror reflecting the struggles that rage in every human heart. From shepherd boy to giant killer to the man after God's own heart, David had climbed every mountain life could offer. He had slain lions with his bare hands in the wilderness of Judea, watching over his father's flocks with a courage that defied his youth. When the Philistine giant Goliath had mocked the armies of Israel, it was young David who stepped forward with nothing but a sling, 5 smooth stones, and unshakable faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That single stone, launched by divine providence and a shepherd's skill, had changed the course of history. Goliath fell, the Philistines fled, and a nation discovered that their future king had been hiding in plain sight among Jesse's sons. The same hands that had held a shepherd's staff now held a royal scepter. The same voice that had sung to sheep in quiet fields now commanded armies and wrote psalms that would endure forever. David had united the 12 tribes into one mighty nation, transforming a loose confederation of clans into an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the borders of Egypt. He had conquered Jerusalem, the ancient Jebusite stronghold that had seemed impregnable, and made it the political and spiritual center of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant, symbol of God's presence among his people, now rested in a tent on Mount Zion, and David himself had danced before it with such abandon that it scandalized the religious elite, but delighted the heart of God. But perhaps David's greatest challenge wasn't facing wild beasts in the wilderness or enemy armies on the battlefield. It wasn't navigating the political complexities of uniting fractious tribes or managing the logistics of governing a growing empire. It was something far more personal, far more intimate, and ultimately far more painful. It was being a father. The heart that beat with such fierce love for God now beat with equally fierce love for his children. The man who could write, "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him," understood both sides of that equation intimately, and sometimes the very depth of a parent's love can become a weakness that destroys what it seeks to protect. David's household was a complex web of relationships that would challenge even the wisest of men. In the ancient world, political marriages were common, and David had married strategically to cement alliances and secure his kingdom's borders. The result was a palace filled with multiple wives, each bringing their own family dynamics, their own ambitions for their children, and their own expectations of royal life. Multiple wives meant multiple children, each with their own personalities, talents, and claims to their father's attention. It was a household that could have been a showcase of unity and strength, demonstrating how God's blessing could create abundance and harmony. Instead, it became a powder keg of jealousy, competition, and simmering resentments that would eventually explode into violence and civil war. The palace that should have been filled with the laughter of children and the joy of family became an arena where brothers competed for their father's approval, where half-siblings eyed each other with suspicion, and where the question of succession hung like a sword over every conversation. In trying to be everything to everyone, David sometimes became not enough for anyone. Among all David's sons, none commanded attention, quite like Absalom. Scripture tells us with poetic precision that from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. This wasn't merely an ancient way of saying he was handsome. This was a description of perfection so complete, it seemed almost supernatural. Absalom stood tall and straight as a cedar of Lebanon, with shoulders broad enough to carry a kingdom and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and charm. His features were perfectly proportioned, as if carved by a master sculptor who understood divine geometry. But his most striking feature was his hair, golden locks so magnificent that when he cut them once a year they weighed 5 pounds by the royal standard. This wasn't just genetic lottery luck. This was a man who seemed crafted by the divine hand to be a king. When he walked through Jerusalem's streets, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Merchants abandoned their stalls, children pressed forward to catch a glimpse, and even hardened soldiers found themselves staring in admiration. Absalom didn't just have presence. He had the kind of magnetic attraction that made people want to follow him anywhere. But, as we'll discover in this tragic tale, outward beauty can mask inner darkness. Sometimes the most stunning exteriors hide the most poisonous heart. Sometimes the very gifts that God gives us to serve His purposes become the tools of our destruction when pride takes root and begins to grow. The seeds of Absalom's rebellion weren't planted in a moment of sudden rage or a single act of defiance. They were sown slowly, carefully, watered by a series of family tragedies that would tear David's house apart from the inside, like a cancer that grows silently before it reveals its presence. The poison that would destroy Absalom's relationship with his father began with events that seemed unrelated to royal succession or political ambition. It began with lust. It began with power abused. It began with a violation so heinous that it would set brother against brother and ultimately lead to civil war that would shake the kingdom to its foundations. Amnon, David's firstborn, was heir apparent to the throne of Israel. By every measure of law and custom, he was destined to wear the crown his father had worn so magnificently. He had position, privilege, and the presumption of succession. But he also had a darkness in his heart that would prove his undoing and create a chain of events that would nearly destroy the kingdom. Amnon had become obsessed with his half-sister, Tamar, Absalom's full sister. What started as inappropriate desire escalated into a carefully planned assault that would reveal the depths of depravity possible when power is divorced from morality. Using deception and the trust that came with being family, Amnon lured Tamar to his quarters under the pretense of needing care during an illness. The assault that followed was brutal in its premeditation and devastating in its consequences. Amnon raped Tamar, then compounded his crime by discarding her afterward like a broken toy. His lust turned immediately to revulsion and hatred. The woman he had claimed to love became an object of contempt the moment his desire was satisfied. Tamar's response reveals the magnitude of the trauma inflicted upon her. She tore her ornate robe, the special garment that marked her as a virgin daughter of the king, put ashes on her head, and went away weeping aloud. Her brother Absalom found her in this state, and with a mixture of tenderness and barely controlled rage, took her into his house to care for her. When the news reached David, his reaction was explosive fury, but not decisive action. Scripture tells us that he was very angry, but it also tells us what he didn't do. He didn't punish Amnon. He didn't seek justice for Tamar. He didn't take the kind of decisive action that the situation demanded and that his role as both king and father required. Perhaps David was paralyzed by the magnitude of the crime and its implications for the royal family. Perhaps he couldn't bear to punish his firstborn, the son who represented the future of his dynasty. Perhaps he was caught between his role as a father who loved his children and his responsibility as a king who must uphold justice. Perhaps he hoped that time would somehow heal such a devastating wound without requiring the kind of painful surgery that might save the patient but would certainly leave scars. But David's silence spoke volumes to another son who was watching, waiting, and planning. Absalom heard his father's silence as clearly as if David had spoken aloud, and what he heard was abandonment. What he heard was a father choosing political expediency over family loyalty. What he heard was the message that some sons mattered more than others, that some injustices were too inconvenient to address, that power trumped righteousness when the stakes were high enough. Absalom was Tamar's full brother, and his love for his sister burned as intensely as his hatred for Amnon. While David wrestled with the political and personal implications of what had happened, while the palace buzzed with whispered conversations and carefully neutral expressions, Absalom made his decision with the clarity that comes from moral certainty. He would be the justice that his father failed to provide. He would be the protector that his sister deserved. He would be the man who stood up when standing up mattered regardless of the consequences. For 2 full years, he nursed his anger like a carefully tended flame, planning his revenge with the patience of a hunter stalking the most dangerous prey imaginable. The waiting was deliberate and calculated. Absalom understood that acting in the heat of immediate anger would make his actions look like a crime of passion, undermining the justice he sought to achieve. He also needed time to plan an approach that would succeed without immediately bringing David's wrath down upon him. Most importantly, he needed Amnon to become comfortable again, to let his guard down, to believe that time had indeed healed the wound he had inflicted. The moment came at a sheep-shearing festival in Baal-Hazor, near the border of Ephraim. Sheep-shearing was traditionally a time of celebration and abundance, when the year's work paid off in valuable wool, and the community gathered to feast and celebrate God's provision. It was the perfect cover for what Absalom had planned. Absalom invited all his brothers to join him for the celebration, including the unsuspecting Amnon. The invitation appeared generous and familial, a sign that Absalom was ready to move past the unpleasantness of the previous 2 years. Even David was invited, though he declined to attend the entire royal household, citing the expense such an entourage would create for his son. The wine flowed freely. The atmosphere was festive, and the gathered brothers relaxed in what seemed like genuine family celebration. Amnon, perhaps relieved that his crime seemed to have been forgotten, perhaps emboldened by wine and the passage of time, let his guard down completely. He had no idea that every smile from Absalom, every toast, every gesture of apparent reconciliation was actually part of an elaborate execution. When the moment was perfect, when Amnon was thoroughly drunk and completely vulnerable, Absalom gave the signal. His servants, carefully instructed and positioned in advance, struck with the efficiency of professional assassins. David's firstborn was murdered while he sat at his brother's table, killed by the very family he thought he was celebrating with. The other brothers, suddenly understanding the deadly game they had unknowingly joined, fled in terror. Some mounted horses, others ran on foot, all desperate to escape before Absalom's justice expanded to include anyone who might threaten his sister's honor or his own sense of righteousness. In one bloody moment, David had lost 2 sons, one to wickedness, another to vengeance. The heir apparent was dead, and the son who had killed him was now a fugitive. The carefully constructed facade of royal family harmony had been ripped away, revealing the ugly truth that lay beneath the surface of palace life. Absalom fled immediately to his grandfather's kingdom in Geshur, a small but strategically located state north of the Sea of Galilee. His mother, Maacah, was the daughter of King Talmi of Geshur, and blood ties provided sanctuary that political considerations might not have guaranteed. For 3 long years, father and son lived in separation, each nursing wounds that time seemed only to deepen rather than heal. David mourned daily, torn between his love for Absalom and his duty as king to uphold justice. The man who had written some of the most beautiful psalms of worship and thanksgiving now walked the halls of his palace like a ghost, haunted by the choices his children had made and the choices he had failed to make. The palace that once rang with the laughter of children now echoed with the footsteps of a lonely father walking corridors filled with memories of better times. Every room held reminders of the sons he had lost, Amnon through death, Absalom through exile. The weight of kingship, which had once seemed like a divine calling and a joyful responsibility, now felt like a burden too heavy to bear. David's grief was complicated by guilt. Had his failure to act decisively after Tamar's assault contributed to the violence that followed? Had his desire to avoid difficult decisions made those decisions inevitable? Had his love for his children actually enabled their destruction? These questions haunted his days and disturbed his sleep, creating a kind of living hell that no external enemy had ever managed to inflict. Meanwhile, in Geshur, Absalom was experiencing his own form of exile. He was safe from immediate consequences for his actions, but he was also cut off from everything that had defined his identity. He was a prince without a kingdom, an heir without an inheritance, a son without a father's blessing. The man who had been the center of attention wherever he went in Jerusalem was now just another royal refugee in a foreign court. Yet, even in exile, Absalom's natural charisma and political intelligence served him well. He studied the art of governance from a different perspective, learning how smaller kingdoms survived in the shadow of greater powers. He observed how his grandfather maintained independence through careful diplomacy and strategic alliances. Most importantly, he had time to think, to plan, and to nurture the seeds of ambition that had been planted by his father's perceived abandonment. The separation might have continued indefinitely, but David's heart as a father eventually overcame his duty as a king. Through the intervention of Joab, David's most trusted general, and perhaps the only person who dared to challenge the king when necessary negotiations were opened for Absalom's return. Joab, with his characteristic combination of military directness and political cunning, recognized that the kingdom needed resolution. The question of succession had been thrown into chaos by Amnon's death, and Absalom's continued exile was creating uncertainty about the future that enemies might exploit. Using an elaborate ruse involving a wise woman from Tekoa, who told David a parable about family justice, Joab maneuvered the king into a position where allowing Absalom's return became not just merciful, but politically necessary. Eventually, Absalom was allowed to return to Jerusalem, but even then, reconciliation was incomplete. David, perhaps fearing that showing immediate favoritism would appear weak or unjust to the people who had supported Amnon, perhaps still struggling with his own conflicted feelings about his son's actions, imposed conditions that revealed his ongoing uncertainty. Absalom could return to his house in Jerusalem, but he could not see the king's face. For 2 more years they lived in the same city, but remained strangers. A father and son separated by a few miles of city streets, but an ocean of unresolved grief, unspoken accusations, and wounded pride. Can you imagine the poison this bred in Absalom's heart? Here was a young man who had everything: stunning looks that stopped conversations, natural charisma that drew people like a magnet, royal blood that guaranteed privilege and position, the admiration of everyone who met him. Yet he felt rejected by the one person whose approval mattered most. In Absalom's mind, David had failed as both king and father. As king, he had failed to provide justice for Tamar, forcing Absalom to take matters into his own hands. He was now treating his son like a criminal, rather than embracing him as someone who had defended family honor when the head of the family would not. The narrative that formed in Absalom's mind was compelling and dangerous. David was getting old, perhaps losing the judgment that had made him great. The kingdom was being managed by bureaucrats and politicians who cared more about procedure than people. The king was isolated from his subjects by layers of protocol and advisors who filtered information to protect their own positions. But most painfully for Absalom, David seemed to love his role as king more than his role as father. When forced to choose between political considerations and family relationships, he consistently chose politics. When faced with difficult decisions that might damage his reputation, he chose silence over justice. When his son needed his support, He chose the safety of distance over the risk of reconciliation. This is where pride whispers its first seductive lie. You deserve better than this. You could do better than him. The people would love you more than they love him if they just had the chance to see what real leadership looks like. Pride is a master manipulator, and it had found the perfect target in Absalom. Here was a young man with genuine gifts and legitimate grievances, real talents and authentic wounds. Pride didn't need to invent reasons for resentment. It just needed to magnify the ones that already existed and suggest that the solution was not reconciliation, but revolution. Absalom was everything a prince should be, at least on the surface. Standing tall and straight with the bearing of natural royalty, he commanded attention wherever he went. His golden hair, worn longer than was fashionable, but perfectly suited to his features, caught the light like a crown, even when he wore none. His voice carried the authority of someone born to command, and the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about others. When he walked through Jerusalem's markets, merchants left their stalls to catch a glimpse of royalty that looked like their idealized vision of what royalty should be. When he rode through the streets, children ran alongside his chariot with the unrestrained enthusiasm that only the young can muster. Mothers lifted babies to see the beautiful prince, and old men pointed him out to their grandsons as an example of what God's blessing looked like in human form. But Absalom possessed more than just physical beauty. He had inherited his father's magnetic charisma, that indefinable quality that made people want to be near him, to please him, to serve out his vision of what the world could become. He also had his grandfather's shrewd political mind, shaped by years of observing how smaller powers survived and thrived in a world dominated by larger kingdoms. Most dangerously, he had developed his mother's gift for reading people and understanding what they needed to hear. He knew instinctively how to make every person feel like the most important individual in the room. He had that rare ability that all great leaders possess, the talent for making people believe that he truly cared about their problems, their dreams, their fears, and their aspirations. And perhaps in the beginning he did care. Perhaps there was a time when young Absalom genuinely wanted to serve his people and honor his father's legacy. Perhaps his concern for justice was authentic. His desire to help people was real, and his vision for the kingdom was noble. But somewhere along the way, noble intentions became calculating ambition. Genuine concern became a tool for gaining power. Love became leverage. Service became a strategy for dominance. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, like the way a beautiful fruit can rot from the inside while maintaining its appealing exterior. Pride crept in, slowly whispering that David was getting old and losing touch with his people. Pride suggested that the kingdom needed fresh leadership from someone who understood the challenges facing a new generation. Pride painted a picture of Absalom as the natural solution to problems that his father was too set in his ways to solve. The whispers were subtle and compelling. Look how the people respond to you. See how they light up when you pay attention to them. Notice how they bring their problems to you instead of going through official channels. They're telling you something, Absalom. They're telling you that you're the leader they've been waiting for. Scripture doesn't tell us exactly when Absalom decided to steal his father's throne, but the signs were there for those who knew how to read them. He began positioning himself not just as a prince waiting for his turn to rule, but as the solution to problems that apparently couldn't wait for normal succession to address. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Instead of challenging his father's authority directly, which would have been seen as obvious rebellion, Absalom positioned himself as the king's representative to the people, someone who cared enough to listen when the official system seemed too busy or too bureaucratic to respond. Every morning he would station himself at the city gates, the traditional place where judicial matters were decided and where people brought their disputes for resolution. His presence there appeared natural and helpful. A prince making himself available to serve his people, demonstrating the kind of hands-on leadership that citizens appreciated. His routine was carefully choreographed and devastatingly effective. "What city are you from?" he would ask, with seemingly genuine interest, his voice warm and welcoming, his manner suggesting that he had all the time in the world for this conversation. "From one of the tribes of Israel," they would reply, often intimidated by the presence of royalty, but charmed by his approachable manner and apparent interest in their welfare. Then came the masterful stroke delivered with perfect timing and apparently sincere concern. "Look," Absalom would say, placing a sympathetic hand on their shoulder, his beautiful face creased with worry on their behalf. "Your claims are valid and proper. Anyone can see that you have a legitimate case. But there is no representative of the king to hear you. The system is broken, and you're the one suffering for it." He would pause, letting that sink in, watching as frustration and disappointment clouded their faces. He was validating their sense that they deserve better treatment, while simultaneously undermining confidence in the current system. Then, with the timing of a master performer who understood exactly when his audience was ready for the climax, he would deliver the killing blow. "If only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice. Real justice, swift justice. The kind of justice you deserve but aren't getting from the current system." The message was clear, without being explicitly treasonous. The current system was failing. The king was either unaware of the problems or unwilling to address them. But here was someone who cared, someone who would make things right, someone who understood that government should serve people rather than the other way around. Day after day, month after month, year after year, Absalom stood at that gate like a spider in the center of an increasingly elaborate web. He wasn't just building a political following, he was crafting a narrative that would justify revolution when the time came. The story he told was simple, seductive, and devastatingly effective. David was old and out of touch, too removed from common people to understand their real needs. The bureaucracy had grown slow and inefficient, more concerned with protecting its own prerogatives than serving the public good. The common people were being forgotten while the powerful received preferential treatment. Justice was delayed, and delayed justice was no justice at all. But Absalom, young, energetic, beautiful Absalom, he would be different. He would be the king who truly loved his people, who would tear down the barriers between royalty and commoners, who would make the government work for everyone instead of just the elite. He would bring energy to a tired system innovation, to outdated methods and genuine care, to a process that had become cold and impersonal. When people approached him with the respect due to royalty bowing low as protocol demanded, Absalom would have none of it. Instead, he would reach out, grasp them by the shoulders, and pull them into an embrace like they were old friends reuniting after years apart. The gesture was shocking in its intimacy and powerful in its message. This prince didn't consider himself above the people he would one day rule. He kissed them, asked about their families, remembered their names from previous encounters, inquired about their troubles with the kind of personal attention that made them feel valued and heard. He treated every person as if their problems were his problems, their concerns were his concerns, their welfare was his personal responsibility. The effect was intoxicating. People who had felt ignored by the system suddenly felt seen. Citizens who had felt like numbers in a bureaucratic process suddenly felt like individuals whose lives mattered. Subjects who had felt distant from their government suddenly felt like they had a personal relationship with someone who would one day have the power to change their circumstances. In this way, Scripture tells us with devastating clarity, Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. Stole, that's the word the Bible uses, and it's chosen with surgical precision. Not won, not earned, not gained through legitimate service or proven leadership. Stole. Because what Absalom was doing wasn't actually governance or authentic service. It was theft on a massive scale, carefully disguised as benevolence. He was stealing affection that rightfully belonged to his father, who had earned it through decades of faithful service and proven leadership. He was stealing loyalty that David had built through battles fought and victories won through the blood and sweat of forging a nation from fractious tribes. He was stealing trust that had been established on a foundation of character, tested in crisis and commitment demonstrated through hardship. He was stealing hope from people who needed it, then redirecting that hope toward himself, instead of toward the legitimate solutions their problems required. He was stealing time and emotional energy that could have been invested in making the current system work better, channeling it instead into fantasies about how much better things would be under different leadership. Most insidiously, he was stealing the very concept of justice, taking something beautiful and necessary and twisting it into a tool for personal advancement. Real justice requires patience, wisdom, careful investigation, and the willingness to make difficult decisions that might not be popular. Absalom's version of justice was immediate, emotional, and designed to make people feel good rather than to actually solve their problems. But in Absalom's mind, there was no theft occurring. In his carefully constructed narrative, he was simply giving the people what they deserved: attention, respect, justice, hope. His father had failed them through neglect or incompetence. The system was broken through age or indifference. Someone had to step up and fix it, and he was the logical choice. Someone young enough to have energy for the demanding work of hands-on leadership. Someone beautiful enough to inspire confidence and pride in the kingdom's future. Someone charismatic enough to unite the people behind a common vision of what Israel could become under proper guidance. The tragedy of pride is that it always comes dressed as righteousness. It never presents itself as rebellion. It masquerades as reform. It doesn't announce itself as selfishness. It poses as service to a higher good. Pride is the master of disguise, and Absalom had become its perfect puppet, dancing to its tune while believing he was choreographing his own destiny. For 4 long years, Absalom played this dangerous game with the skill of a master strategist. 4 years of morning conversations at the city gate, each one carefully calculated to build his reputation while undermining confidence in his father's leadership. 4 years of networking throughout the kingdom, identifying key influencers and winning them to his cause through personal attention and promises of better treatment under his leadership. 4 years of presenting himself as the prince who should be king, the son who understood what the father had forgotten, the leader who could bridge the gap between the palace and the people. 4 years of building a narrative that painted David as a great king whose time had passed, and Absalom as the natural successor who could restore the kingdom to its proper glory. The irony was devastating. David had indeed become somewhat isolated from his people, but not through indifference or incompetence. The weight of ruling a large and complex kingdom, the burden of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, the responsibility of maintaining security in a dangerous neighborhood. These demands had naturally created some distance between the king and individual citizens. But instead of working within the system to address these legitimate concerns, instead of using his position as prince to help bridge that gap constructively, Absalom chose to exploit it for personal gain. Instead of solutions, he offered revolution. Instead of reform, he planned rebellion. And then one day, when his web was complete and his plans were ready, when he had identified his supporters throughout the kingdom and prepared them for action, Absalom made his move with the timing and precision of a military campaign. "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord," he said to his father. His voice carefully modulated to sound humble and devout, his manner, suggesting that spiritual concerns were motivating this request rather than political ambitions. It was a masterful deception. David, still hoping for genuine reconciliation with his estranged son, still believing that time and prayer might heal the wounds between them, still seeing Absalom as the troubled young man he loved, rather than the calculating politician he had become, agreed immediately. "Go in peace," David said, perhaps relieved that Absalom seemed to be turning his heart toward God, perhaps hoping that spiritual renewal might lead to personal healing and family restoration. But there would be no peace. Peace was the last thing on Absalom's mind as he left Jerusalem with his carefully selected entourage. Absalom took 200 men with him from Jerusalem, men who went innocently, having no idea what they were about to become part of. These weren't conspirators. They were unwitting pawns in a game much larger and more dangerous than they could imagine. Their presence would lend legitimacy to what was about to happen, while providing witnesses who could testify that they had seen nothing treasonous in Absalom's behavior. But Absalom had also sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, carrying a very different message to a very different audience. These messengers sought out the key supporters Absalom had cultivated during his 4 years of political preparation, the men who had been carefully selected and gradually won over to his cause. "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets," his messengers whispered in the ears of his supporters, their voices carrying the electric excitement of revolutionaries about to see their dreams realized, "then shout, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" Hebron, the choice of location, was deliberate and symbolically devastating. This was the same city where David had first been crowned king of Judah 30 years earlier, the place where David's reign had begun in ceremony and celebration. It was the ancient city of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a place steeped in the history of God's covenant with his people. For Absalom to declare himself king in Hebron was to claim not just political succession, but spiritual legitimacy. He was saying, in effect, that his kingship represented continuity with the sacred traditions of Israel, that he was the rightful heir not just to David's throne, but to the covenant promises that throne represented. When those trumpets sounded across the hills of Judah on that fateful day, they weren't just announcing a new king, they were declaring war against the old one. The beautiful prince who had stolen hearts was now stealing a kingdom, and there would be no going back for anyone involved. The carefully orchestrated rebellion unfolded with the precision of a military operation. In cities throughout Israel, Absalom's supporters suddenly emerged from hiding, declaring their allegiance to the new king and calling on their neighbors to join the revolution. The network Absalom had built over 4 years activated simultaneously, creating the impression of a spontaneous popular uprising while actually representing the culmination of careful planning and patient preparation. The messenger who brought the news to David arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with soot from the desperate ride through the night. His face was grim with the weight of information that would shatter a kingdom and break a father's heart. "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom," he gasped, barely able to catch his breath, but understanding that every second mattered in the unfolding crisis. The words hit David like physical blows, each one carrying implications that expanded like ripples in a pond. All those mornings at the gate, all those conversations with the people, all those embraces and promises and carefully crafted speeches designed to build trust and affection. It hadn't been reconciliation Absalom was seeking. It had been revolution. David, the man who had faced down Goliath without flinching, who had charged into battle against impossible odds throughout his career, who had built an empire through courage and determination, felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, not fear of death. He had made peace with mortality long ago, but something far worse, the fear of a father whose child had become his enemy, the man who had written, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Now faced a different kind of valley, a different kind of shadow. This wasn't the clean fear of physical danger, where courage and skill might prevail. This was the complex terror of family betrayal, where love itself became a weapon turned against the one who felt it most deeply. "We must flee," David told his officials, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible realization, each word carrying the pain of a father who finally understood how completely he had misread his son's intentions. "Or none of us will escape from Absalom. Come, we must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." The decision to flee rather than fight wasn't cowardice. It was wisdom born of bitter experience and deep love. David understood that a siege of Jerusalem would mean suffering for innocent people who had done nothing to deserve becoming casualties in a family war. He also understood that his presence in the city made it a target, and his absence might spare it from destruction. Most painfully, David understood that fighting his son in the streets of Jerusalem would require him to treat Absalom as an enemy rather than as the child he still loved despite everything that had happened. Fleeing bought time. Time to think, time to plan, time to hope that perhaps some solution might yet be found that wouldn't require a father to choose between his kingdom and his son. Picture this heartbreaking scene. The great King David, who had transformed Jerusalem into the city of God, walking barefoot out of his own capital in the early morning light. His head covered in mourning according to ancient custom, tears streaming down his weathered face, his royal robes replaced by the simple garments of a refugee fleeing for his life. Behind him walked his household, servants who had chosen loyalty over safety, soldiers who preferred exile with David to comfort under Absalom family members whose own lives were now at risk because of their connection to the deposed king. The procession was small but significant, representing the remnant of those whose loyalty couldn't be bought or stolen. As they walked through the streets of Jerusalem, the contrast with Absalom's triumphal entry was stark and painful. Where Absalom would soon be greeted with celebration and acclamation, David left quietly, almost secretly, like a thief in the night. The palace gates that had opened for David for decades now stood ready to welcome his son. The same servants who had brought David his morning meals were already preparing to serve a new master. The same guards who had protected David's sleep were already shifting their allegiance to the younger, more charismatic prince. How quickly loyalty can evaporate when power changes hands. How swiftly the mighty can fall when pride and ambition collide with divine destiny. But the most heartbreaking image of all was David himself, climbing the Mount of Olives, as the sun rose over Jerusalem, weeping as he walked. This was the man who had once written, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Now he was a shepherd without a flock, a king without a kingdom, a father whose son had become his greatest enemy. The irony was devastating and prophetic. David was walking the same path that another descendant would walk centuries later. Jesus, who would also be rejected by those he came to save, who would also weep over Jerusalem, who would also climb this same mountain carrying the weight of betrayal and broken hearts. The Mount of Olives had become a place of sorrow for kings, a summit of suffering for those called to lead God's people. Yet, even in his darkest hour, even as his world collapsed around him like a house built of sand, David's first concern revealed the depth of his father's heart. When his commanders gathered to ask for orders, when his advisors demanded to know his strategy for the battles ahead, when practical men needed practical answers to immediate tactical questions, David gave one clear, unmistakable instruction that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." Those words echoed through the ranks like thunder, revealing the complexity of a heart that could wage war while still hoping for reconciliation. Here was a king going to battle against a son who wanted him dead, yet his primary concern wasn't victory or survival. It was his enemies' safety. A father's love doesn't die when that love is answered with rebellion. A parent's heart doesn't harden when that heart is broken by the very child it beats for. Even facing civil war, even fleeing for his life, even knowing that Absalom wanted him destroyed, David's deepest desire was still his son's welfare. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Absalom was experiencing every ambitious person's ultimate fantasy. The crown was on his head. The throne was beneath him, and the people were chanting his name in the streets with the enthusiasm of those who believed they were witnessing the dawn of a new and better era. He had done it. He had actually done it. The impossible dream had become reality through careful planning and patient execution. The son had overthrown the father, the young had defeated the old beauty, and charisma had triumphed over tradition and established authority. Everything he had worked for, everything he had planned, everything he had sacrificed was finally coming to fruition. But crowns are heavier than they appear in dreams, and thrones are colder than they seem in imagination. Almost immediately, Absalom discovered that wanting power and wielding power are two entirely different experiences, requiring different skills and imposing different burdens. His first major test came from Ahithophel, David's former counselor, who had defected to Absalom's cause. Ahithophel was a political genius, a man who understood power dynamics with the clarity of a mathematician solving equations. He knew that successful revolutions require more than popular support. They require decisive action that makes return to the old system impossible. Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Ahithophel advised, with the cold calculation of a chess master moving pieces across a board, his eyes glittering with the strategic implications of such an action. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute. It was shrewd counsel as politically effective as it was morally repugnant. In the ancient world, claiming a predecessor's wives or concubines was the ultimate declaration that the old regime was dead and the new one was permanent. It was a bridge-burning exercise designed to make reconciliation impossible and force everyone to choose sides definitively. The symbolism was unmistakable and intentional. By taking his father's whim, Absalom would be declaring that he had completely replaced David in every aspect of kingship. There could be no negotiation after such an act, no possibility of sharing power, no hope of peaceful resolution. It was total war, disguised as a symbolic gesture. So Absalom erected a tent on the palace roof in full view of all Jerusalem and publicly violated his father's concubines. It was a spectacle designed to humiliate David and demonstrate Absalom's complete control over everything that had once belonged to his father. The message was clear to everyone who witnessed it. There could be no going back, no negotiation, no reconciliation. The war between father and son was now total and irrevocable. But Ahithophel had more advice, and this time it was even more urgent and strategically critical. Let me choose 12,000 men and pursue David tonight. He urged his voice, carrying the excitement of someone who could see victory within reach. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. It was brilliant military strategy, the kind of thinking that had made Ahithophel David's most trusted advisor for years. David was vulnerable, disorganized, fleeing, with only a handful of supporters and no time to prepare defensive positions. A swift night attack would end the civil war before it truly began, prevent the massive bloodshed that would come from a prolonged conflict and establish Absalom's reign as a fait accompli that even his enemies would have to accept. The plan had the elegance of simplicity and the power of decisiveness. Strike fast, strike hard, eliminate the source of opposition, and then rule with magnanimity toward those who had followed the losing side. It was the kind of strategy that kings are remembered for when it succeeds and condemned for when it fails. But God had other plans, and sometimes the Almighty works through the most unlikely instruments to accomplish His purposes. Unknown to Absalom, David had managed one final masterstroke before fleeing Jerusalem, a move that demonstrated why he had been such a successful king for so many years. He had sent Hushai, his longtime friend and counselor, back to the capital with specific instructions that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. If you return to the city and say to Absalom, "Your Majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant," then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. David had instructed with the wisdom of someone who understood that wars are won as much by intelligence as by strength. It was a desperate gambit, requiring Hushai to risk his life by pretending to defect while actually working as a double agent. Discovery would mean certain death, not just for Hushai, but probably for his entire family. But Hushai was not just David's counselor. He was his friend, willing to die if necessary, to save the man who had shown him such loyalty over the years. The relationship between David and Hushai illustrates something beautiful about true leadership. It inspires devotion that goes beyond duty or self-interest. Hushai didn't risk his life because he was ordered to do so, but because he loved David and believed in the righteousness of his cause. When Absalom's war council convened to decide how to pursue David, both advisors were present. The tension in the room was palpable as two very different strategies were presented, each carrying enormous implications for the future of the kingdom. Ahithophel spoke first, laying out his plan for immediate attack with the precision of a military engineer drawing blueprints for a siege. His proposal was logical, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Strike while the enemy is weakened. The conflict quickly minimize casualties on both sides and establish the new regime's legitimacy through decisive victory. Then Hushai rose to speak and everything changed. His task was almost impossible. He had to convince Absalom to reject sound military advice without appearing to be sabotaging the war effort. He had to appeal to Absalom's vanity and pride while making his alternative seem strategically superior. "The advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had counseled kings for decades, his manner suggesting that he was reluctantly disagreeing with a colleague he respected, but whose judgment was flawed in this particular instance. The statement was bold and risky. Ahithophel's reputation for wisdom was well established, and contradicting him directly could backfire spectacularly. But Hushai had studied Absalom during the war council, watching his expressions, reading his body language, understanding the psychological dynamics that would make his argument persuasive. "You know your father and his men." Hushai continued, building momentum like a master storyteller who understood exactly how to hold his audience's attention. "They're fighters, and here's as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops where a surprise attack could easily find him. Hushai was painting a picture of David as a defeated refugee fleeing in panic, but as a dangerous cornered animal who would strike back with the fury of desperation and the skill of experience. He was describing David's men not as a ragtag group of fugitives, but as battle-hardened veterans who knew how to fight dirty and hit hard when their survival was at stake. Even now he is hidden in a cave or some other place, Hushai said, his voice dropping to add dramatic emphasis to his words. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier whose heart is like the heart of a lion will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are brave. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Hushai was planting seeds of doubt, making Absalom question whether his forces were truly ready for battle against David's experienced warriors. He was suggesting that a failed attack would be worse than no attack at all, because it would damage Absalom's reputation for invincibility before his reign had even been established. Then came the alternative plan wrapped in flattery that appealed directly to Absalom's vanity and his desire for personal glory. So I advise, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you with you yourself, leading them into battle. The proposal was the exact opposite of Ahithophel's counsel. Instead of a swift surgical strike by a small force, Hushai proposed gathering a massive army that would take weeks to assemble, instead of immediate action that would end the war quickly. He suggested deliberate preparation that would give David time to organize his defenses, most appealing to Absalom's ego. Instead of the new king staying safely in Jerusalem while others fought on his behalf, Hushai proposed that Absalom personally lead his forces into battle, claiming the glory of victory for himself, rather than sharing it with his generals. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, Hushai continued, his voice rising with apparent excitement about the glorious campaign he was describing. And we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not so much as a pebble is left. The imagery was spectacular and appealing to a young man hungry for recognition. Instead of a quick professional military operation that would be forgotten within a generation, Hushai was proposing an epic campaign that would be remembered forever. Instead of a victory won by others in Absalom's name, he was describing a triumph that would establish Absalom as one of the great warrior kings of history. The plan appealed to everything that made Absalom dangerous: his pride in his appearance and his need to be seen as the ultimate leader, his desire for personal glory that couldn't be shared or delegated, his vision of himself as the kind of king who personally led his armies into battle like the heroes of old. Why settle for a quick victory when you could have a spectacular triumph? Why let others claim credit when you could personally lead the charge? Why risk looking like a politician who sent others to fight when you could demonstrate the kind of hands-on leadership that would inspire legends? Absalom and all the men of Israel said the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. Scripture records with devastating simplicity, capturing in a single sentence the moment when pride triumphed over wisdom and vanity overcame strategic thinking. But the Bible also reveals the deeper truth behind this moment, the theological reality that explains how such an obviously poor decision could seem like the right choice to intelligent men, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. God was working behind the scenes, using Absalom's character flaws against him, turning his greatest strengths into the tools of his destruction. Pride had made Absalom susceptible to flattery that any objective observer would have recognized as manipulation. His hunger for personal glory had blinded him to military wisdom that any experienced commander would have seen as obviously superior. The very characteristics that had helped him steal his father's kingdom, his charisma, his pride, his need for adulation, his vision of himself as the perfect king, were now setting the stage for his downfall. God was allowing Absalom to destroy himself through the very traits he considered his greatest assets. While Absalom spent precious weeks gathering his massive army from Dan to Beersheba, sending messengers throughout the kingdom, and waiting for troops to travel from distant territories, David used the time Hushai had bought him to cross the Jordan River, regroup his forces, and prepare for the battle he had never wanted to fight. The contrast between the two camps during this preparation period was stark and revealing. Absalom's forces were impressive in their size and enthusiasm, but weak in their experience and leadership. They were motivated by the excitement of being part of what seemed like a popular revolution, but most had never faced the reality of serious combat. David's army was smaller, but composed of veterans who had been tested in fire and proven in battle. These weren't politically motivated supporters who had joined a cause because it seemed fashionable or promising. These were warriors who had bled with their king men, who knew that David was worth dying for because they had seen him prove worthy of that sacrifice again and again. The king who had fled Jerusalem in tears was once again becoming the warrior who had built an empire through courage and divine favor. But even as David organized his troops, even as he planned his strategy, even as he prepared for war against his own son, his heart remained that of a father first and a king second. When his three commanding generals, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, prepared to march out with their divisions when the final preparations for battle were being made, when the moment had come for the kind of clear, decisive leadership that separates great kings from merely competent ones, David gave them orders that everyone in the camp heard and no one would ever forget. "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." The words echoed through the ranks like a thunderclap, revealing the complexity of a heart that could wage war while still hoping for reconciliation. Everyone heard it. The generals who would have to implement the order, the soldiers who would have to follow it, even in the heat of battle, the servants and camp followers who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in military history. Here was a king going to war against a son who wanted him dead, yet his primary concern wasn't victory or survival, but the safety of his enemy. Everyone understood that King David would rather lose his crown than lose his son. Everyone knew that this wasn't just a political rebellion they were facing, but a family tragedy of the highest order. The order created an almost impossible tactical situation for David's commanders. How do you win a war while protecting the enemy's key leader? How do you achieve decisive victory while minimizing harm to the person whose death would end the conflict most effectively? How do you maintain military discipline while implementing orders that seem to contradict basic strategic thinking? But David's men had learned to trust their king's judgment even when they didn't understand his reasoning. If David said to be gentle with Absalom, then they would find a way to be gentle with Absalom while still doing their duty to protect their king and preserve the kingdom. The morning of the battle dawned clear and cold over the forest of Ephraim, east of the Jordan River. The location had been chosen carefully by David's advisors. Dense woodland that would neutralize Absalom's numerical advantage by preventing large-scale troop movements and coordinated attacks. Two armies faced each other across the valley that separated them, father against son, brother against brother. A kingdom divided against itself in the most literal and tragic sense possible. The sight was both magnificent and heartbreaking, representing the climax of years of family tension and political maneuvering. On one side stood Absalom's forces, a massive army that stretched as far as the eye could see, their numbers creating an impressive display of apparent strength. They outnumbered David's troops nearly 3-1, and their ranks were filled with fresh recruits full of enthusiasm and confidence in their beautiful young king. Absalom himself was a sight to behold as he rode among his troops in the pre-dawn darkness, mounted on a white mule that emphasized his royal status, his golden hair catching the morning sunlight like a crown even before he wore one, his armor polished to mirror brightness that reflected light like a beacon. He looked like victory, personified like destiny riding toward its appointment with greatness. When his soldiers saw him, they cheered with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from believing you're part of something historically significant. Here was a king they could be proud of, a leader who embodied their highest aspirations for what royalty should look like. On the other side was David's army, smaller in number, but tempered by fire, hardened by experience, unified by loyalty, that had been tested and proven in countless previous battles. These weren't politically motivated supporters or fair-weather friends who had joined the winning side. These were warriors who had bled with their king-men, who had followed him through the wilderness when Saul hunted him, veterans who had conquered nations and built an empire through shared sacrifice and mutual trust. They might be outnumbered, but they knew something Absalom's forces didn't. They knew what it meant to fight for someone worth dying for. The contrast between the two armies reflected the deeper contrast between their leaders. Absalom's forces fought for the excitement of revolution, for the promise of better treatment under new leadership, for the thrill of being part of what seemed like inevitable change. David's men fought for love, love of their king, love of their country, love of the values and principles that had made Israel great. The battle began like thunder rolling across the hills, the clash of metal on metal echoing through the forest as 20,000 men collided in a struggle that would determine the fate of a kingdom and the destiny of a dynasty. The sound was deafening, swords striking shields, arrows whistling through the air, men shouting orders and battle cries and death screams. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance, with courage and desperation on both sides, driving men to acts of heroism and horror that would be remembered for generations. Individual combats were decided by split-second differences in skill or luck. Unit formations held or broke based on the leadership of sergeants and the courage of common soldiers. But as the day wore on, experience began to tell in its ways that numbers couldn't overcome. David's veterans, men who knew how to fight in difficult terrain, began to dominate the battlefield. The thick forest that Absalom had thought would provide cover for his movements became a trap for his inexperienced troops. Branches caught at armor and weapons, disrupting attacks and creating confusion in the ranks. Dense undergrowth broke up formation attacks, reducing Absalom's advantage in numbers by preventing him from bringing his full force to bear at any single point. What should have been Absalom's asset, superior numbers, became a liability as his forces struggled to maneuver in the confined spaces between the trees. The forest itself seemed to be fighting against the rebels, as if nature recognized the unnaturalness of a son making war against his father. Trees that had stood for centuries became obstacles that favored the defenders over the attackers. Terrain that should have been neutral became an ally to David's cause. Scripture records the outcome with stark simplicity that emphasizes the magnitude of the disaster. Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. 20,000 men dead in a single day. 20,000 fathers who would never come home to their families. 20,000 sons who would never see another sunrise. 20,000 brothers whose blood would water the forest floor and whose bodies would provide food for wild animals and carrion birds. It was a slaughter on a scale that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. A reminder of the terrible cost of civil war and the price of family conflict that escalates beyond the possibility of peaceful resolution. The forest of Ephraim became a graveyard, a monument to the wages of pride and the consequences of rebellion against legitimate authority. But in the midst of this chaos, in the swirling confusion of a battle that had already been decided in David's favor, the moment that would define the entire conflict and determine the future of Israel was yet to come. Absalom was riding hard through the forest, his white mule carrying him swiftly between the trees as he tried to rally his fleeing troops, or perhaps seeking escape from the disaster his rebellion had become. His magnificent hair, his crown of pride, streamed behind him in the wind as his mount carried him along paths that seemed to offer hope of reaching safety. The irony of the moment was lost on everyone except perhaps God himself, who sees the end from the beginning and understands how pride inevitably leads to destruction. Absalom, who had spent years building his reputation on his beauty and charisma, was now fleeing through a forest where beauty meant nothing and charisma couldn't stop arrows or swords. What happened next would be remembered forever, not just for its tragic irony, but for what it revealed about the wages of pride and the justice of God in dealing with those who rebel against his appointed authority. Absalom's hair, the very symbol of his beauty and vanity, the feature that had made him famous throughout Israel, the physical manifestation of his belief that he was destined for greatness because of his superior appearance, became tangled in the thick branches of an ancient oak tree. As his mule continued forward, panicked by the sounds of battle and unable to understand why its rider was no longer guiding its movement. Absalom was left hanging helpless between heaven and earth, suspended by the very thing he had taken such pride in, trapped by the symbol of his vanity. There he hung, the would-be king, reduced to a helpless victim of his own pride, caught between the earthly kingdom he had tried to steal and the heavenly judgment he had brought upon himself through his rebellion. The man who had promised his followers that he would lead them to victory was now dangling from a tree, as powerless as a child and as vulnerable as the weakest of his subjects. The symbolism was devastating and unmistakable. Absalom had lifted himself up through pride and ambition, and now he was literally lifted up as a sign of God's judgment. He had tried to rise above his father's authority, and now he hung above the ground, neither touching earth nor reaching heaven, suspended in a space that belonged to neither realm. A young soldier saw him first and ran to report to Joab, David's general, and the man responsible for implementing the king's strategy in battle. "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree," he shouted breathlessly, his voice carrying both excitement and uncertainty about what should be done in such an unprecedented situation. Joab's response was immediate and harsh, revealing the practical military mind that had served David so well in countless campaigns. "What, you saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have had to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." It was a commander's reaction, swift, decisive, focused on the tactical advantages of eliminating the enemy's leader while he was vulnerable. 10 shekels of silver was a substantial reward, equivalent to several months' wages for a common soldier. And a warrior's belt was a mark of honor that would bring prestige and recognition. But the soldier's reply revealed something beautiful about David's influence over his men and the depth of loyalty that true leadership inspires. "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai protect the young man Absalom for my sake." Here was a simple soldier in the heat of battle with his enemy helpless before him, and his commanding officer ordering him to strike, refusing to act because his king had commanded mercy. The amount being offered was now 10 times larger than Joab's original promise, enough money to change a common soldier's life forever. But it wasn't enough to make him disobey David's explicit instructions. "And if I put my life in jeopardy," the soldier continued, showing that he understood the political implications of his actions as well as the moral ones. "And nothing is hidden from the king. You would have kept your distance from me." The soldier was acknowledging that David would eventually learn what had happened, and that those who violated his express commands would face consequences regardless of their military rank or political connections. Even Joab, powerful as he was, wouldn't be able to protect someone who had deliberately disobeyed the king's direct orders. It was a testament to David's character that even in civil war, even when fighting for his life against a son who wanted him dead, his men honored his desire to spare that son's life. They trusted David's judgment even when they didn't understand his reasoning, and they valued his approval more than immediate tactical advantages or monetary rewards. But Joab had no patience for sentiment in the middle of a war that threatened to tear the kingdom apart and destroy everything David had built. His loyalty was to David, and to the stability of the realm, and he understood that Absalom's continued existence posed an ongoing threat that mercy couldn't eliminate. "I'm not going to wait like this for you," Joab said grimly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made life and death decisions for decades and understood that leadership sometimes required doing things that were necessary rather than pleasant. Taking 3 javelins in his hand, weapons designed for throwing but heavy enough to serve as spears in close combat, Joab approached the helpless prince with the determination of a man who had already made peace with what he was about to do. Absalom hung there still alive, still breathing, still capable of speech and thought and hope for rescue. For a brief moment, he might have believed that his beauty and royal status would save him even in this desperate situation. Perhaps he thought his father's love would protect him even from his father's enemies. But Joab plunged the 3 javelins into Absalom's heart, while the prince still hung alive in the oak tree, ending the rebellion with swift, brutal efficiency. 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded the suspended figure and finished what their commander had started, ensuring that there would be no possibility of survival or rescue. The beautiful prince, the man who could have had everything if he had simply waited for his father's blessing and divine timing, died alone in the forest. His golden hair a snare rather than a crown, his pride a trap rather than a pathway to glory, his rebellion a one-way road to destruction rather than the route to greatness he had imagined. It was over. The civil war that had torn Israel apart, the rebellion that had driven David from his throne, the family conflict that had broken a father's heart. It all ended with a young man hanging dead in a tree, killed by the very beauty that had defined him and the pride that had driven him to believe he deserved more than God had given him. Joab's men took Absalom's body and threw it into a big pit in the forest, then piled a large heap of rocks over it according to the ancient custom for dealing with traitors and rebels. The prince who had dreamed of a glorious tomb befitting a king was buried like a criminal in an unmarked grave, his final resting place marked only by a pile of stones that would eventually be scattered by weather and time. Meanwhile, all the Israelites who had followed Absalom fled to their homes, the rebellion collapsing as quickly as it had begun, once news of their leader's death spread through the ranks. The army, that had seemed so impressive in its size and enthusiasm, dissolved like mist when faced with the reality that their cause had died with their champion. But David didn't know any of this yet. The king, who had been forced to flee his own capital, sat anxiously between the inner and outer gates of Mahanaim, the city where he had taken refuge east of the Jordan River, waiting for news of the battle that would determine not just his political future, but the fate of his beloved son. David paced restlessly, unable to sit still, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except what was happening in the forest of Ephraim. Every sound might be a messenger bringing news. Every approaching figure might carry word of victory or defeat, of life or death, of reconciliation or permanent separation. 2 messengers raced toward him across the plain in the growing twilight. First, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok the priest, and a young man known for his speed and loyalty. Then a Cushite sent by Joab with official word of how the battle had concluded. Both brought news of military victory, of the rebellion crushed and the kingdom saved from civil war. Both reported that David's enemies had been defeated and his throne was secure. But David had only one question, and he asked it of both messengers with the desperate urgency of a father whose heart hung in the balance. Is the young man Absalom safe? It was the question that revealed everything about David's priorities and the nature of his love for his children. Not, have we won? Not, is the kingdom secure? Not, how many casualties did we suffer? Just one simple, heartbreaking question. Is my son alive? Ahimaaz, perhaps sensing the devastating nature of the truth, he carried perhaps understanding that his answer would shatter the heart of the man he served, tried to soften the blow with careful ambiguity. I saw great confusion, just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me your servant, but I don't know what it was. It was an evasion born of compassion, an attempt to delay the moment when David would have to face the reality that his son was dead. Ahimaaz had run all this way with news of victory, but he couldn't bring himself to deliver the personal tragedy that accompanied the political triumph. But the Cushite, when pressed with the same question, could not soften what could not be softened. His answer was indirect but unmistakable in its implications. May the enemies of my lord the king, and all who rise up to harm you, be like that young man. The truth hit David like a series of physical blows, each word carrying implications that expanded like shock waves through his consciousness. His son was dead. His beautiful, rebellious, beloved son was gone forever. The boy he had held as a baby, the young man he had forgiven, again and again, the prince who had stolen his kingdom but never lost his father's love. Absalom was dead. David's reaction shattered the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. The king, who had celebrated victory over Goliath with dancing and singing, who had written psalms of triumph and thanksgiving after countless military victories, who had always found reasons to praise God even in difficult circumstances, now collapsed in the most profound grief any of them had ever seen. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. His cries echoed through the city of Mahanaim, through the streets where his soldiers should have been celebrating, through the hearts of everyone who heard them. The victory celebration that should have erupted spontaneously was stifled before it could begin. Soldiers who had risked their lives for their king crept back into the city like men ashamed of victory because they saw their king's heart breaking over the very enemy they had defeated. David's grief was so overwhelming, so complete, so devastating in its intensity that it threatened to turn victory into defeat. His men had fought courageously to save his throne and preserve his life, but their king was mourning the death of the one who had tried to destroy both. This is the mystery of parental love. It doesn't end when children rebel. It doesn't stop when they break your heart. It doesn't cease when they choose destruction over blessing, rebellion over reconciliation, pride over humility. David would have gladly traded places with his son, would have died in Absalom's place without hesitation, even after that son had tried to destroy everything David held dear. It's the kind of love that defies logic, transcends justice, and reveals something profound about the heart of God Himself. Because This is how our Heavenly Father loves us. Not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it, not because our behavior justifies it, but because love is who He is, and He cannot deny His own nature. Joab, understanding that David's excessive grief was threatening to demoralize the very troops who had saved his kingdom, eventually confronted the king with characteristic bluntness. "Today, you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you, and hate those who love you." It was a harsh assessment, but Joab understood that leadership sometimes requires saying difficult truths that others are afraid to speak. David's men needed to see that their sacrifice was appreciated, that their victory was valued, that their loyalty was rewarded with something more than watching their king mourn their enemy. Eventually, David pulled himself together enough to appear before his troops and acknowledge their service. But the damage to his spirit was permanent. He returned to Jerusalem and resumed his throne, but he was never quite the same. The man who had once written, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning," found that this particular night of weeping stretched into years of sorrow that would shadow the rest of his reign. In the end, Absalom got exactly what he thought he wanted, and it destroyed him. He wanted to be king, so he seized the crown through deception and force, only to discover that stolen authority has no legitimacy. He wanted glory, so he gathered a massive army and led them personally into battle, only to find that military glory means nothing if you die in defeat. He wanted independence from his father's authority, so he declared war against everything David represented and stood for, only to discover that rebellion against God's anointed brings divine judgment rather than divine blessing. He wanted to be remembered as a great king, and instead he became a cautionary tale about the wages of pride and the consequences of family betrayal. But in trying to grasp what was never meant to be, his Absalom lost everything that could have been his. As David's son, he would have inherited immense wealth, tremendous honor, significant position, and unconditional love. The throne might have been his eventually through legitimate succession blessing, rather than bloodshed divine appointment, rather than human rebellion. Instead, he died alone in a forest, mourned by the very father he had betrayed, remembered it as a warning about what happens when pride overcomes patience and ambition destroys family bonds. The very gifts that God had given him, beauty, charisma, intelligence, became the tools of his destruction when pride took control and turned blessings into curses. The tragedy of Absalom isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting struggles that rage in every human heart. Inside each of us lives a potential Absalom, whispering that we deserve more than what we have, that we're being held back by others, that we know better than the authorities placed over us by God. Pride tells us the same lies it whispered to Absalom 3,000 years ago. You're not appreciated for who you really are. You could do a better job than those currently in charge. They don't understand your potential. You have a right to take what you deserve, even if that means going around or through the people who are supposed to be helping you get there. But Absalom's story shows us where those whispers lead when we listen to them and act on them. Pride promises freedom, but delivers slavery to our own ambitions. It promises elevation, but brings humiliation. It promises glory, but delivers shame. It promises life, but ultimately destroys everything it touches, including the very person it claims to be serving. The biblical principle remains as true today as it was 3,000 years ago. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Absalom had everything a man could want: beauty that made him famous, talent that could have served great purposes, opportunity that most people only dream of, and a father who loved him deeply despite his flaws. But pride made him throw it all away for something that was never meant to be his. Pride convinced him that waiting for God's timing was unnecessary when human ambition could achieve the same results faster. Pride persuaded him that his father's love was conditional and political rather than unconditional and personal. How often do we make the same mistake in our own lives? How often do we look at what others have and decide we deserve it more than they do? How often do we rebel against authority, against our parents, our leaders, our circumstances, against God Himself? Because we think we know better than the one who designed the universe and holds our lives in His hands. How often do we assume that delay means denial, that God's timing is too slow for our needs, that we have to take matters into our own hands to get what we believe we deserve? How often do we interpret love as weakness, patience as indifference, mercy as permission to push boundaries until we get our way? Absalom spent 4 years building his rebellion, carefully cultivating supporters, positioning himself for the moment when he could strike and seize what he wanted. 4 years of patient planning, strategic networking, and careful image management. 4 years of presenting himself as the solution to problems that he was actually helping to create. But in all that time, he never once went to his father and said, "I'm sorry. I want to make things right between us. I want to honor you and serve the kingdom you've built. I want to be the son you deserve rather than the rival I've become." He never sought genuine reconciliation, never addressed the root issues that had caused their separation, never humbled himself to receive the forgiveness that David's heart was already prepared to give. He never tried to understand his father's position or appreciate the complexities of leadership that had created some of the problems he was criticizing. Instead, he chose the path of pride, the way of rebellion, the road that seemed right to human eyes, but led ultimately to destruction and death. Instead of working within the system to bring about positive change, he worked to tear down the system and replace it with himself. David's response throughout this entire ordeal reveals a different way, the way of love that persists even when it's rejected, the way of grace that continues even when it's spurned, the way of a father's heart that breaks for his children even when they shatter his world with their choices. David could have hardened his heart against Absalom and had every justification for doing so. After all, his son had murdered his brother Amnon in cold blood, stolen his crown through deception and manipulation, violated his honor by publicly claiming his concubines, divided his kingdom, and caused a civil war that killed 20,000 people and forced him to flee for his life from the city he had made great. David had every legal right to be angry, every justification for revenge, every reason to write Absalom off as an enemy who deserved whatever fate befell him. The law supported David's right to punish rebellion. Political necessity demanded that he eliminate the threat Absalom represented. Military strategy required that he treat his son as he would treat any other enemy leader. But love doesn't work that way. True love, the kind that reflects the very heart of God, doesn't stop loving when love becomes difficult. It doesn't give up when the beloved becomes unlovable. It doesn't withdraw when the object of its affection turns hostile. It grieves, it weeps, it suffers, and it would even die if it could save the one who is bent on self-destruction. This is how our Heavenly Father loves us, and David's love for Absalom gives us a glimpse into that divine heart. Even when we rebel against God's authority, even when we think we know better than He does about what's best for our lives, even when we pursue our own kingdoms instead of seeking His kingdom first, His love doesn't end. God's heart breaks over our rebellion, but He never stops being our Father. He never stops hoping for our return. He never stops working to bring us home, even when we're running as fast as we can in the opposite direction. He never stops loving us even when our choices break His heart and require Him to discipline us for our own good. The story of Absalom should break our hearts, not just for the beautiful prince who threw his life away, but for every time we've chosen pride over humility, rebellion over submission, our limited understanding over God's perfect will for our lives. But it should also give us hope, because it shows us that no matter how far we've fallen, no matter how badly we've rebelled, no matter how thoroughly we've broken our Father's heart, His love still reaches toward us. His desire is still restoration, not destruction. His goal is still reconciliation, not revenge. The cross of Jesus Christ is God's ultimate answer to every Absalom story. When we were in rebellion against Him, when we were His enemies, when we deserved nothing but judgment, God demonstrated His love for us by sending His Son to die in our place. Jesus absorbed the punishment that our rebellion deserved so that we could receive the inheritance His perfect obedience earned. He took our sin, our pride, our rebellion upon Himself, so that we could be restored to our Father's house as beloved children rather than condemned enemies. The question is, will we respond like Absalom, letting pride drive us further from our Father's heart until it destroys us? Or will we respond like the prodigal son in Jesus' parable, who came to his senses in a far country and returned home to find his father running to meet him with arms wide open and a heart full of forgiveness? Every day we face the same choice Absalom faced. Every day we decide whether to build our own kingdoms or seek God's kingdom first. Every day we choose between the whispers of pride that promise us glory and the call of love that offers us something far better, a place in our Father's house, a role in His eternal plan, an inheritance that no earthly crown could ever match. Absalom thought he was fighting for his rights, but he was actually fighting against his destiny. God had a plan for his life, a good plan, a plan that would have brought him true honor and lasting significance. But pride blinded him to that plan and drove him to pursue a crown that would become his curse instead of his blessing. What about you? What crown are you pursuing that might actually be leading you away from God's best for your life? What throne are you trying to claim that was never meant to be yours? What rebellion are you nursing that's actually rebelling against the one who loves you most? What authority are you resisting that God has placed in your life for your protection and growth? What patience are you unwilling to exercise because you think you know better than God about the timing of your blessings? What relationship are you damaging because pride won't let you admit you were wrong? The story of Absalom is ultimately about choices. The choice between pride and humility, between rebellion and submission, between our limited understanding and God's infinite wisdom. Absalom made his choice, and it led to destruction. But we don't have to follow the same path. We can choose humility over pride, recognizing that God's ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts higher than our thoughts. We can choose submission over rebellion, trusting that the one who created us knows what's best for us better than we know ourselves. We can choose to walk in His paths instead of demanding that He bless our plans. We can choose to believe that His timing is perfect even when it doesn't match our timeline. We can choose to trust His love even when His plans seem to delay our dreams. We can choose to honor His authority in our lives even when our pride tells us we deserve better treatment, faster promotion, or immediate gratification of our desires. We can choose to wait for His blessing rather than seizing what we want through our own efforts. The crown Absalom died trying to seize was nothing compared to the inheritance that could have been his as a faithful son. And whatever earthly crown we might gain through prideful ambition is nothing compared to the eternal inheritance that awaits us as faithful children of the Most High God. In the ancient world, Absalom built a monument to himself in the king's valley, saying, "I have no son to carry on the memory of my name." He was so concerned about being remembered, so focused on leaving a legacy, so driven by the need for significance and recognition, that he erected a stone pillar to ensure his fame would outlast his life. But the monument he built for himself has crumbled to dust and been forgotten by history, while the monument to his rebellion, this tragic story recorded in Scripture, serves as a warning to every generation about the dangers of pride and the consequences of family betrayal. True significance doesn't come from seizing power or demanding recognition. It doesn't come from building monuments to ourselves or forcing others to acknowledge our importance. It comes from faithfully serving the purposes of God, from humbly walking in the path He has prepared for us, from being content with the role He has assigned us in His eternal story. David understood this principle, even in his grief over Absalom, even in his pain over the kingdom's division, even in his sorrow over the thousands who had died in a war that should never have been necessary. David knew that his ultimate significance didn't come from any earthly crown, but from his relationship with the King of Kings. That's why he could write even in his darkest moments, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That's why he could say, even after losing so much, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." David's identity wasn't tied to his political position, or his family relationships, or his military victories. His identity was rooted in his relationship with God, and that relationship was secure regardless of what happened in the temporary world of human politics and family dynamics. As we close this tragic tale, let us remember David's heartbroken cry, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." That cry echoes through history, but it finds its ultimate answer in another father's heart. The heart of God, who loved us so much that he actually did what David could only wish he could do. When we were in rebellion against him, when we were his enemies, when we deserved nothing but judgment, God sent his Son to die in our place. The cross is God's answer to every Absalom story. It's his way of saying, "I would rather die than lose you. I would rather suffer than see you destroyed by your pride and rebellion. I would rather sacrifice everything than watch you throw away the inheritance I have prepared for you." Jesus died the death that our rebellion deserved so that we could receive the inheritance his perfect obedience earned. He took our sin, our pride, our rebellion upon himself so that we could be restored to our Father's house as beloved children rather than condemned enemies. This is the gospel. Not that we have to be good enough to earn God's love, but that he loves us enough to make a way for us to come home, no matter how far we've strayed, no matter how badly we've rebelled, no matter how much we've broken his heart with our choices. The question isn't whether you've been like Absalom. We all have moments when pride has whispered its seductive lies, and we've listened. We all have times when we've thought we knew better than God about what was best for our lives. We all have seasons when we've resisted his authority and pursued our own agendas. The question is, what will you do about it now? Will you continue down the path of pride, insisting on your rights, demanding your way, building your own kingdom in opposition to God's rule? Will you keep fighting against your Father's authority, convinced that you know better than he does about timing and blessing and what you need for true happiness? Or will you humble yourself before the King of Kings, confess your rebellion, and receive the forgiveness and restoration he offers? Will you surrender to his love rather than continuing to fight against it? Will you choose to trust his heart even when you don't understand his ways? The choice is yours, but remember, pride goes before destruction, but humility leads to honor. The way up in God's kingdom is down. The way to true life is through death to self and surrender to Christ. The way to an eternal crown is through taking up your cross and following Jesus, even when that means giving up things you think you deserve. Don't let pride rob you of your eternal destiny. Don't let rebellion cost you your heavenly inheritance. Don't let the pursuit of an earthly crown cause you to lose your eternal reward. Don't let the desire for immediate gratification blind you to the eternal pleasures God has prepared for those who love him. Come home to your Father's house. His arms are open wide, just like they were for the prodigal son. His heart is breaking for you, just like David's heart broke for Absalom. But unlike David, God has the power not just to grieve over our rebellion, but to transform us completely by his grace. This is the end of Absalom's story, but it doesn't have to be the end of yours. You can choose a different ending, an ending marked not by pride and destruction, but by humility and restoration, an ending that brings joy to your Father's heart instead of breaking it. You can choose to be remembered not as someone who fought against God's plan, but as someone who surrendered to his love. You can choose to leave a legacy not of rebellion and tragedy, but of faith and obedience that inspires others to seek God's kingdom first. The question that began this story still stands. What hurts more? Being betrayed by an enemy or watching your own child rise against you? But now we understand that the question isn't just about the pain of betrayal. It's about the power of love. Love that persists even when it's rejected. Love that grieves even when it's spurned. Love that would rather die than see the beloved destroyed. That's the love of your heavenly Father. That's the love that sent Jesus to the cross. That's the love that's calling you home today, no matter how far you've wandered, no matter how badly you've rebelled, no matter how much your pride has cost you and those around you. Don't let pride keep you from answering that call. Don't let rebellion rob you of that love. Don't be another Absalom, beautiful, but broken, talented, but tragic, close to the kingdom, but lost in the forest of your own pride and ambition. The forest where Absalom died has long since returned to peace. The trees that witnessed his final moments have fallen and been replaced by new growth. The battlefield where 20,000 men lost their lives has been reclaimed by nature and forgotten by history. But the lessons of that tragic day remain as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. Pride still goes before destruction. Rebellion against God's authority still leads to death. Family bonds still matter more than political ambition. A father's love still endures even when children break his heart. And God's love still reaches toward every prodigal son and daughter, every rebellious child, every prideful heart that thinks it knows better than its creator. His love still offers forgiveness for every Absalom who is willing to come home. Come home. Your Father is waiting, and his love for you will never die.